He married her to win a bet and lost far more than his honor. Before we begin this heartbreaking story, know that it took place in the sugar-cane plantations of Martinique in 1836. Tell me, where are you listening to this story right now, from home, while working, or on the road? Leave a comment. I love knowing where my stories follow you. And if true, historical tales like this move you, don't forget to subscribe, because today, I'm going to tell you one of the most brutal and tragic stories colonial Martinique ever witnessed. A story of pride, of power, and of redemption that came too late. The March night was suffocating inside the grand colonial house of the Morel family. The air, heavy with tropical moisture, mixed with the scent of tobacco and aged rum flowing freely in crystal glasses. Outside, the cane field stretched endlessly under a moonless sky, and the monotone song of crickets melted into the coarse laughter of men gathered around the massive mahogany table. Etienne Morel was 32, his face carved like stone by the Antillean sun, his glacial blue eyes never truly smiling. The only son of a planter, enriched by the slave trade, he had inherited at 25 one of the island's largest estates, 350 hectares of fertile land, a modern refinery, and nearly 200 enslaved souls, who labored from sunrise to sunset under the ruthless gaze of the overseers. That night, Etienne hosted his peers. Auguste Beaufort, an owner of a neighboring plantation and a lover of racehorses; Matthew Deschamps, a sugar merchant whose ships crossed the Atlantic; and Louis-Philippe de Castel, a fallen aristocrat who had fled France after the July Revolution, now trying to rebuild his fortune under the tropic sun. As always, their talk circled around power, wealth, and control, the unchallenged dominion they held over their lands. Rum poured endlessly, loosening tongues and erasing the last traces of restraint. "You're too proud, Morel," said Auguste Beaufort, puffing on his cigar, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "You claim you can control everything, own everything, transform everything. But I bet even you couldn't civilize a savage and turn her into a lady fit for high society." Silence fell upon the room. The men exchanged knowing looks. Etienne slowly set down his glass, his face remaining perfectly still. "What do you mean by that, Beaufort?" His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Well," Auguste continued, settling deeper into his leather chair, "you've always said the blacks were only good for field work, that they had neither intellect nor refinement. But what would happen if you took one under your roof? If you dressed her like a lady, taught her our manners, could you transform her?" Matthew Deschamps burst out laughing. "Better yet, what if you married her? Imagine the scandal. The great Etienne Morel, heir to one of the oldest planter families, marrying one of his own slaves." The men now laughed openly, their voices echoing against the portraits of stern-faced ancestors. But Etienne did not laugh. His face hardened, his jaw clenched tight. Pride, that sin which had destroyed so many men before him, gripped his heart like poison. "You think I wouldn't dare?" His voice had turned sharp as steel. "Oh, we know you could," replied Louis-Philippe de Castel with a crooked grin. "The question is, would you? Would you defy every convention, risk your name, and publicly marry one of your slaves?" The challenge was made. Inside Etienne's heart, pride and reason waged a silent war. He thought of his status, his family name, his inheritance. Then he thought of those men who mocked him, doubted him, believed him incapable of such audacity. "Very well," he declared. Finally, his decision was made, in a moment of contained fury. "I will prove it to you. I will choose one of my slaves." I will marry her before God and before men, and I will make her a lady you will all respect." Silence fell again, heavier this time. The men looked at one another, realizing perhaps they had gone too far. But it was too late. Etienne's pride had been wounded, and he was not a man to retreat. "And what will be the stakes of this wager?" asked Auguste, suddenly more serious. "If I succeed," replied Etienne with a cold smile, "each of you will owe me 1,000 francs and publicly acknowledge my triumph. If I fail, each of you may claim 100 hectares of my land." It was an enormous sum, a reckless risk. But for Etienne Morel, it was no longer about money. It was about proving his absolute superiority, his power to bend the world to his will. Hands clasped around the table, the pact was sealed. The next morning, as the sun rose over the sugar-cane fields still wet with dew, Etienne descended toward the slave quarters. He was searching for someone docile, someone he could easily shape. His eyes swept over the tired faces of men and women, preparing for another day of relentless toil. And then he saw her. Abeline was 20, but her face already bore the marks of a lifetime of hardship. Born on the Morel plantation, the daughter of a mother who died in childbirth and a father she never knew. She had worked in the great house since she was 12, first in the kitchen, then as a maid. She was silent, efficient, and above all she knew her place. Or so Etienne believed. That morning, Abeline wore a simple, faded blue cotton dress. Her black hair was braided tightly against her skull. Her deep brown eyes, almost black, stayed fixed on the ground when she crossed paths with the master. She had long since learned never to look a white man in the eyes. "You," called Etienne, his voice commanding. "What's your name?" "Abeline, master," she replied, barely audible, eyes still lowered. "Raise your head." She obeyed slowly, revealing a face of delicate features. Skin the color of polished ebony, gleaming faintly in the morning light. And eyes that, for an instant, seemed to look straight through him. "You work in the house?" "Yes, master." "Good, from today you will be—" He hesitated, realizing the absurdity of what he was about to say. "You will be my fiancée." The word dropped like a stone into a well. Abeline did not react at once. Her face remained perfectly still. But in her eyes, Etienne saw something flicker. Was it fear, confusion, or disgust? Around them the other slaves froze. No one dared to breathe. The overseer, a brutal mulatto named Jacques, stepped forward. "Master Morel, I don't understand." "You don't need to," Etienne cut him off sharply. "Prepare the blue room upstairs. Abeline will live there from now on. Bring her proper clothes, and send for Madame Dubois immediately." Madame Dubois was the housekeeper, a Frenchwoman from the mainland, about 60 years old, who had served the Morel family for 20 years. When she was summoned, her face paled. But she was too well-bred to question her employer aloud. Abeline was led into the great house through a door she had never been allowed to pass before. Her bare feet touched, for the first time, the cold marble of the entrance hall. Her eyes took in the crystal chandeliers, the gold-framed paintings, the fine furniture imported from France. But she felt no wonder, only a slow, rising terror. In the blue room, Madame Dubois stared at her for a long time, trying to understand what was happening. Then, with a resigned sigh, she began her task. "Undress," she ordered curtly. Abeline obeyed, trembling. She was washed, perfumed, and dressed in a green silk gown, worth more than anything she had ever owned. Or rather thought she owned. For in truth she owned nothing, not even her own body. Meanwhile, in his study, Etienne was writing to the parish priest. The marriage had to be arranged quickly, before rumors spread too far, before he changed his mind, before reason returned. But reason that night had drowned in pride and in rum. The 3 weeks that followed were a whirlwind of absurd, humiliating preparations. The news of the marriage spread like wildfire across all of Martinique. Through the salons of Fort-de-France, the shops and the markets. Everywhere, people spoke of Etienne Morel's madness. Some laughed openly, others voiced disgust. A few, very few, saw it as courage. But they were wrong. It wasn't courage. It was pure arrogance. A display of power pushed to its extreme. The parish priest, Father Germain, was the first to try to reason with Etienne. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and gentle eyes. He had devoted his life to bringing a semblance of spiritual comfort to the tormented souls of this island, scarred by violence and injustice. "Monsieur Morel," he began during a visit to the plantation, "I understand that you may have developed an affection for this young woman, but marriage is a sacred sacrament. One cannot—" "Oh, one cannot what, Father?" interrupted Etienne, his tone icy. "Marry whomever I wish, am I not free?" "You are free, certainly," replied the priest with patience. "But this young woman, is she? Can she truly consent to this marriage when she is he hesitated on the word, your slave?" "She will be freed on the day of the wedding," replied Etienne sharply, though he had not really thought through the matter. "Does that satisfy you?" Father Germain looked at him for a long moment, searching in those cold blue eyes for a trace of humanity, of doubt, of remorse. He found only ice. "Very well," he finally said, defeated. "May God forgive you for what you are about to do." Meanwhile, in the Blue Room, Abeline lived a strange and unreal existence. Madame Dubois was teaching her the manners of colonial society, how to stand straight, how to speak with her mouth barely open, how to handle cutlery at a formal dinner, how to walk gracefully in the cumbersome dresses that cut off her breath. Abeline learned everything with a speed that surprised even the governess, not from a desire to please, but from an instinct to survive. She had long understood that her life was not her own, and that resistance led only to pain. So she bent, she obeyed, she became what was expected of her. But at night, alone in that luxurious room that felt more like a gilded prison than a refuge, she cried silently. She thought of her mother, whom she had never known, her grandmother, who had raised her in the huts until the old woman died of exhaustion and grief, and her friends, who still worked in the fields under the burning sun. April finally arrived, the day set for the wedding. The morning was radiant, the sky a dazzling blue, yet a heavy tension floated in the air like the prelude to a storm. The church of Sainte Marie in Fort-de-France, with its whitewashed walls and steeple reaching toward the heavens, was filled to bursting. Not with well-wishers come to bless the union, but with onlookers eager to witness the scandal of the century. The pews groaned beneath the weight of the crowded bodies, and outside, a crowd had gathered, whites, mulattoes, even slaves brought by their masters to show them what happens when one dares to rise above one's station. Etienne had arrived early, dressed in a flawless black suit, gray silk vest, and a perfectly tied white cravat. He stood rigid before the altar, his face expressionless, though the hands clasped behind his back betrayed a nervousness he refused to admit. At his side stood Auguste Beaufort, Matthew Deschamps, and Louis-Philippe de Castel, his witnesses and the architects of this disaster. Their faces bore barely contained smirks. To them, this was nothing but entertainment, a cruel comedy played at the expense of a defenseless woman. Then the church doors opened. A Béline appeared in the doorway, and a murmur rippled through the congregation. She wore a wedding gown that Madame Dubois had commissioned, white silk, embroidered with fine pearls, a train 3 meters long, and a lace veil imported from Lyon. Upon her head rested a crown of orange blossoms that filled the air with fragrance. Someone had even dusted her face with pale powder, a pitiful attempt to make her appear less black, more acceptable. But it was in her eyes that the true tragedy lived. They were empty, terribly empty, as if her soul had retreated somewhere unreachable, where no one could wound it again. She walked slowly down the central aisle alone, for there was no one to give her away. Each step echoed against the stone floor, accompanied by the mocking whispers of the crowd. Look at her, a negress in a wedding dress, a disgrace to our society. Morel has lost his mind. The words struck her like stones, yet she kept walking, eyes fixed straight ahead until she reached Etienne. He did not look at her. His gaze remained on the altar, jaw clenched tight. Father Germain began the ceremony in a trembling voice. My dearly beloved brethren, we are gathered here today to celebrate the union before God of... He paused briefly, drawing breath. Monsieur Etienne Alexander Morel and Mademoiselle Béline. She didn't even have a last name, nothing to prove her past existence, nothing that truly belonged to her. The priest continued, reciting the sacred texts, speaking of love, of faithfulness, of eternal commitment. Every word rang like mockery in that place. In the crowd, someone stifled a laugh. Another whispered a vulgar comment that made his neighbors snicker. When the moment for the vows arrived, Father Germain turned toward Etienne. Monsieur Morel, do you accept to take as your wife Mademoiselle Béline, here present, and to remain faithful to her in happiness and in hardship, in health and in sickness, to love and to cherish her all the days of your life? Silence fell upon the church. Everyone waited. Etienne opened his mouth, and for an endless instant he seemed to hesitate. His eyes finally rested on Béline, and for the first time he truly looked at her. He saw her frozen face, her hands trembling slightly beneath the bouquet of white flowers, her eyes reflecting no emotion, no joy, no hope, not even anger. Only a terrifying emptiness. Yes, he said at last, his voice echoing through the entire church. I do. The priest then turned toward Béline, and his voice grew softer, almost compassionate. Mademoiselle Béline, do you accept to take as your husband Monsieur Etienne Morel, here present? But before he could finish, Béline spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, and every one of her words carried to the back of the church. Do I have a choice, Father? The silence that followed was deafening. Father Germain turned pale. Etienne stiffened. In the congregation, the murmurs ceased all at once. That simple question, spoken with quiet dignity, had torn through the veil of hypocrisy and revealed the raw, brutal truth of this masquerade. No one answered. What could one possibly say? After a long moment, Béline lowered her eyes and murmured, Yes, I accept. The rings were exchanged, a gold band set with diamonds for her, symbol of a wealth she would never truly possess. Father Germain recited the final formula hastily, as if eager to be done with this unholy ceremony. I now declare you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Etienne turned toward Abeline. She lifted her face to him, and he leaned down. But the kiss that should have sealed their union was nothing more than a brief, cold contact, devoid of any emotion. When he drew back, he saw a single tear roll silently down Abeline's cheek, tracing a pale path through the white powder that covered her skin. Outside the church, the crowd had grown hostile. Shouts rose, some hurled insults, others threw objects. A rotten egg smashed against the carriage meant to take them back to the plantation. Etienne, his face closed and hard, helped Abeline climb in, then got in himself and ordered the coachman to whip the horses. The return journey was spent in complete silence. Abeline gazed out the window at the passing landscape, the sugarcane fields, the green hills, the sky slowly darkening with heavy clouds. Etienne, on his side, stared at his hands, perhaps realizing for the first time the magnitude of what he had done, but he was too proud to admit it. Back at the plantation, a banquet had been prepared. Auguste, Matthew, and Louis-Philippe were already there, along with a few other planters who had not wanted to miss the spectacle. They laughed, drank, toasted to Etienne's social experiment. Abeline was seated at the place of honor beside her new husband. They served her dishes she had never tasted, on porcelain plates she had so often washed but never used. Around the table, conversations flowed, but no one addressed her directly. She sat there, displayed like a curiosity, a living trophy of one man's arrogance. Madame Dubois stood quietly in a corner of the room, watching the scene with deep sadness. She had seen Abeline born, had watched her grow up in the workers' huts, and now she saw her seated at that table, a prisoner of a fate she had never chosen. The evening dragged on late into the night. When the guests finally left, staggering with drink, leaving behind them a room strewn with broken glass and spilled food, Etienne finally rose. "Come," he said simply to Abeline. She followed him to the main bedroom, his bedroom now, which she would have to share with the man who had bought her, who had wagered on her, who had married her out of pride and cruelty. But once the door was closed, Etienne did not approach her. He remained standing near the window, staring into the dark night, his shoulders tense. "You'll sleep there," he said, pointing to a small couch by the fireplace. "I won't," he stopped, searching for his words. "I won't touch you. This marriage is a formality, nothing more." Abeline said nothing. She sat down on the couch, still wearing her now crumpled wedding dress, and waited for him to fall asleep, only then allowing herself to release the sobs she had held back since morning. Outside, the storm that had been threatening for hours finally broke. Rain began to pour in torrents, beating down on the roofs and the earth as if the sky itself wept over this cursed union. The months that followed the wedding were marked by a strange routine. Etienne and Abeline lived under the same roof, bore the same name, yet were strangers to each other. Every morning, Etienne rose before dawn to inspect the plantations, oversee the harvests, and speak with the overseers. He spent his days on horseback, riding through his lands, making sure everything ran according to his strict demands. In the evenings, he would return. Tired, dirty, Etienne would retreat to his office, where he examined the accounts, replied to business correspondence, and drank rum until exhaustion finally drove him to bed. Abeline, for her part, lived in a kind of social limbo. She was no longer a slave. The papers of emancipation had been signed on the day of the wedding, as promised, but she was not truly free either. She wore expensive dresses, slept in a master's house, yet could not leave the property. She had the right to speak, but no one really listened to her. She was the wife of a wealthy planter, yet everyone treated her like an impostor, an anomaly best ignored. Madame Dubois, moved by pity, continued her teaching. Every afternoon, she would meet Abeline in the music room, where the governess taught her to read and write in French. Abeline absorbed everything with a thirst for knowledge that astonished the old woman. "You are intelligent, my child," said Madame Dubois one day, watching Abeline draw perfectly formed letters on her slate, "far more intelligent than most of the men who rule this island. It is a crime that you were born into such conditions." Abeline lifted her eyes, surprised by such rare honesty. "Why do you tell me this, madame?" "Because," the governess replied, letting out a deep sigh, "I am an old woman who has spent her life serving a system I know to be unjust. Because in you, I see something I have never seen in anyone else in this house, not even in Monsieur Morel. You have a dignity that no one can take away from you, no matter what they do." Those words touched Abeline deeply. For the first time since the wedding, she felt something crack within the icy wall she had built around her heart. She did not cry. She had shed all her tears in the first weeks, but she smiled faintly. A sad, yet genuine smile. Weeks turned into months. June brought the summer rains, transforming the paths into torrents of mud. July saw the great harvest, a time when all the slaves of the plantation worked 18 hours a day beneath a blazing sun to cut, carry, and crush the cane. From the windows of the great house, Abeline watched the men and women she knew, people she had lived among, and her heart bled for them. One July evening, when Etienne returned late after an especially grueling day, he found Abeline standing in the entrance hall, arms crossed, her gaze steady. "I need to speak to you," she said. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him since the wedding. Apart from the few good mornings and good evenings, they exchanged out of mere politeness. Etienne stopped, surprised, his boots still covered in reddish mud. "What do you want?" His voice was weary, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Marie, one of the women who works in the kitchens, is ill. She has had a fever for 3 days and can no longer stand. Her overseer refuses to let her rest and has threatened to whip her if she does not return to work tomorrow." Etienne frowned. "And so, it's not the first time a slave has fallen ill. She'll recover or she won't." "She will die," Abeline interrupted, her voice trembling slightly but filled with determination. "She will die if she isn't treated properly. She needs a doctor, rest, and care." "Call a doctor for a slave," Etienne gave a bitter laugh. "Do you know how much that costs?" Abeline took a step forward, locking eyes with him. "How much is a human life worth, Etienne?" Silence fell between them. It was the first time she had ever called him by his name, the first time she had dared to defy him so openly. In her brown eyes, he saw a flame he had never noticed before, or perhaps one he had refused to see. "You forget your place," he said harshly, though without conviction. "My place," she repeated, "You're right," barely containing her bitterness. "Our society is full of contradictions. And what exactly is my place? I am your wife in the eyes of the law, yet you treat me like a shadow. I am free on paper, yet a prisoner in this house. I am expected to behave like a lady, yet constantly reminded that I am nothing but a black woman who got lucky. So tell me, Etienne, what exactly is my place?" Her words struck Etienne like blows. He opened his mouth to reply, but no sound came out. For the first time in months, he was confronted with the truth of what he had done, not the social absurdity of their marriage, not the scandal it had caused, but the suffering of a real woman with thoughts, feelings, and a conscience. "I'll call the doctor tomorrow," he finally said, before climbing the stairs heavily toward his room. The next day, Dr. Renault, a man in his 40s who had studied in Paris, came to examine Marie. He diagnosed a severe case of typhoid fever and prescribed medicine, rest, and a light diet. Etienne, true to his word, had everything prepared. Marie survived. That night marked a subtle turning point in the relationship between Etienne and Abeline. It was not affection, not yet, but a mutual recognition. Etienne began to realize that Abeline was not the docile, mindless creature he had imagined. And Abeline, in turn, began to see in Etienne not a heartless monster, but a deeply flawed man, shaped by a cruel system he had never thought to question. In the following weeks, something strange began to happen. Etienne, who usually dined alone in his study, started taking his evening meals with Abeline in the grand dining room. At first, he ate in silence, the soft clinking of cutlery on porcelain the only sound between them. But gradually, conversations began to emerge. "Why did you learn to read?" he asked one evening, watching Abeline, who had brought a book to the table. "Because," she replied, lifting her eyes, "when one knows how to read, one can escape, not physically, but mentally. Inside those pages, I'm not Abeline the freed slave, the wife by wager. I'm just someone discovering the world." Etienne slowly nodded. "And what are you reading now?" "The Persian Letters by Montesquieu," she answered. "Madame du Bois lent it to me. It's fascinating to see how a foreigner perceives French society, all its contradictions, its hypocrisies." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she had just said and to whom. But Etienne didn't get angry. He even smiled slightly, a real smile, not the cold grimace he usually wore. That was the beginning of a strange friendship. Each evening they discussed books, philosophy, and the political unrest in France, where the July monarchy was facing growing tension. Abeline had firm opinions, and she no longer hesitated to express them. Etienne, to his own surprise, enjoyed their debates. After years surrounded only by planters whose conversations revolved around money and control, he found it refreshing to talk to someone who truly thought, who questioned, who challenged. One September evening, as a tropical storm raged outside, Etienne came down to the parlor and found Abeline sitting near the window, watching the rain fall with a melancholy expression. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. She turned to him, visibly hesitating to answer. Then she decided to tell the truth. "I'm thinking about my mother. I never knew her, but they told me she loved the rain, that she would always go out when it rained, even when the overseer ordered her to stay inside. She would stand there, arms open, face lifted toward the sky, smiling as if the rain could wash everything away, the pain, the humiliation, the servitude." For a few moments, Etienne remained silent, moved despite himself by the image. "She died giving birth to me," Abeline continued, her voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. "Sometimes I wonder if she would be happy to see what I've become, free on paper but still chained." "You're not chained," Etienne protested weakly. Abeline turned to him with a gaze of heartbreaking intensity. "Really? Then let me go." The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Etienne realized with a sudden shock that he didn't want her to leave. It was no longer about pride, nor about a bet. It was something else, something he couldn't yet name. He searched for his words. "Stay, please." "Why?" "Because," he finally admitted, his voice low, "you're the most honest person I've ever met." Abeline looked at him for a long moment, trying to decipher whether he was sincere or simply playing another game. But in his blue eyes, For the first time, she saw something that looked like vulnerability. "I'll stay," she said at last, "but not because you order me to, because I choose to." That night beneath the storm, their relationship changed forever. They sat there for hours, speaking of their lives, their regrets, their hopes. Etienne told her of his lonely childhood, of his tyrannical father who had never shown him affection, of his mother who had died young from a tropical illness. Abeline spoke of her grandmother, of life in the slave huts, of the songs the workers hummed in the fields to forget their pain. And somewhere between those confessions, something was born, not love, not yet, but understanding, respect, perhaps even the first stirrings of a clumsy tenderness. The months passed. October brought the first cooler breezes. November saw the end of the rainy season. And throughout that time, the transformation of Etienne and Abeline continued, slow but profound. In December, Auguste Beaufort and his Parisian companions came to visit the plantation, eager to see how the experiment was progressing. What they found left them speechless. Abeline was sitting in the parlor, dressed in an elegant burgundy gown, embroidering a handkerchief with perfect precision. When they entered, she rose with grace, greeted them in impeccable French, and began the conversation about the political situation in France revealed a surprisingly deep knowledge of current affairs. "She reads Le Courrier des Colonies every week," Etienne explained, with barely concealed pride. "And she holds very firm opinions on the question of the abolition of slavery." The three men exchanged uneasy glances. The wager had been made in cruelty and arrogance, but now it seemed they had succeeded, though not in the way they had imagined. Abeline had not become a parody of a white lady. She had become something far more complex, far more compelling. An educated woman, articulate, defending her convictions with intelligence. "Well then," Auguste finally said, clearly unsettled, "it seems you've won your wager, Morel." But Etienne shook his head. "There is no wager any more, Auguste. There never really was one." That sentence left the three men puzzled. They didn't understand what Etienne meant. How could they? Men who saw others only in terms of property and power could never understand that Etienne had discovered something more precious than money or pride, the humanity of another soul. The year 1837 began under the best of omens. The harvests had been excellent. The price of sugar was at its highest on the European markets, and the Morel plantation was thriving. But more important still, within the grand house, a fragile peace had taken hold. Etienne and Abeline now lived like a true couple. They did not yet share the same room. Some barriers were too deeply rooted to be crossed so quickly. But they shared their days, their meals, their thoughts. One February morning, Abeline did something daring. She went down to the kitchen, where several enslaved women still worked, and sat with them to eat breakfast. At first they were terrified, believing she had come to spy on them or reprimand them. But Abeline spoke softly, in Creole, a language she had not used in months. "I have not forgotten you," she said. "I know what you lived through. I have lived it too." An old woman named Josephine, who had been a friend of Abeline's grandmother, burst into tears and held her tightly in her arms. The other women, reassured, began to talk, to share their struggles, their sorrows. Abeline listened, her heart heavy, realizing how far she had drifted from these women who should have been her sisters. "I will try to help you," she promised. "I don't yet know how, but I will try." She kept her word. In the days that followed, She began speaking to Etienne about the living conditions of the enslaved, not accusingly, but matter-of-factly describing the endless days, the meager food, the disproportionate punishments for minor faults. "Do you think they're happy working for you?" she asked one evening. "Do you really believe they sing in the fields because they love their lives?" Etienne grew uneasy. "That's how the world works, Abeline. Without their labor, this plantation wouldn't exist." "And what if the world itself is wrong?" she countered. "In France, more and more voices are rising against slavery. Victor Sculpture is publishing pamphlets. Abolitionist societies are forming. The wind is turning, Etienne. You can go on denying reality, or you can become a better man." Those words stayed engraved in Etienne's mind. In the weeks that followed, he truly saw his plantation for the first time, not as an owner measuring productivity, but as a human being looking at other human beings. He saw the fatigue in their eyes, the scars on their backs, the resignation in their movements. In March, he made a decision that shocked every planter in the region. He reduced the working hours in his fields, improved food rations, and forbade corporal punishment without his personal authorization. It wasn't much, far from the total abolition Abeline dreamed of, but it was a beginning. "Why are you doing this?" Auguste demanded during a visit from several landowners. "You'll lose productivity. The other slaves in the area will hear of your weakness and demand the same. You're opening the door to chaos." "Maybe," Etienne replied calmly. "Or maybe men who are less exhausted, less hungry, less terrified will work better." But deep inside, it wasn't about productivity. It was about conscience. Abeline had awakened something in him he had spent his whole life burying: his own humanity. Spring brought with it a fragile but genuine happiness. Etienne and Abeline spent their evenings together, reading, conversing, sometimes even laughing. He taught her to ride a horse, and they took long rides at sunset through the green hills overlooking the Caribbean Sea. She taught him to see beauty in small things: a hummingbird sipping from a flower, the scent of jasmine after rain, the smile of a child. One April evening, as they watched the sun set from the veranda, Etienne took Abeline's hand. It was the first time he had ever. He hadn't touched her willingly since that cold kiss at their wedding, almost a year earlier. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Abeline turned toward him, her eyes questioning. "For everything," he went on, his voice trembling with emotion. "For marrying you the way I did. For the humiliation I caused you. For turning you into the object of a foolish wager." He paused, searching for his words. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I ask for it anyway." Abeline remained silent for a long moment, her eyes searching Etienne's face for sincerity. And she found it. "I don't know if I can completely forgive you," she said honestly. "Some wounds run too deep." But she gently squeezed his hand. "I can try." That night, for the first time, Etienne and Abeline shared the same bed. Not out of duty, not from physical desire, but out of a need for closeness, for human warmth, for connection. They fell asleep entwined, two broken souls trying to heal each other. The following months were the happiest Abeline had ever known. She discovered what it meant to be truly loved, respected, and heard. Etienne, for his part, discovered what it meant to love someone for who she truly was, not for what she represented, nor for what she could bring him. But happiness in a world as unjust as theirs is always fragile. In August 1837, a cholera epidemic struck Martinique. The disease spread rapidly, killing hundreds, enslaved and masters alike. The Morel plantation was not spared. Abeline insisted on helping care for the sick. Despite Etienne's protests, fearing for her health, she went down to the huts every day, bringing clean water, medicine, and comfort. She washed fevered brows, held the hands of the dying, prayed with those who still had the strength to pray. It was during this terrible time that she truly earned the respect of the plantation's enslaved people. They had been wary of her at first, seeing her as a traitor who had abandoned her own to live in luxury. But when they saw her risking her life to care for them, when she could have remained safe in the grand house, they understood she had not forgotten where she came from. On September 14th, Abeline herself fell ill. Etienne went mad with terror. He summoned the best doctor from Fort-de-France, spent a fortune on imported medicines, and kept vigil by her bedside day and night, refusing to sleep. He prayed to a God he hadn't believed in for years, pleading, bargaining, promising anything if only she would live. For 3 days, Abeline burned with fever, delirious, calling for the mother she had never known, speaking in Creole of freedom and endless ocean. Etienne held her hand, weeping openly, realizing how deeply he truly loved her, how much he needed her, how empty life would be if she left him. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Abeline opened her eyes, weak but alive. The first thing she saw was Etienne's face, ravaged by exhaustion and worry, and she smiled. "You look terrible," she whispered with a faint laugh. Etienne burst into tears, pressing his forehead against her hand. "I thought I'd lost you, I thought." "I'm here," she said softly, running her fingers through his hair. "I'm here." That ordeal sealed their love forever. When Abeline recovered, they married a second time, not before a church full of mocking onlookers, but in private, with only Madame Dubois and Father Germain as witnesses. This time the vows had meaning. This time the kiss was filled with true love. The new year began with hope. Cholera had finally receded, leaving behind hundreds of dead, but also a few grateful survivors. Among them was Abeline, stronger and more determined than ever. She convinced Etienne to do even more to improve the living conditions of the enslaved. Together they built an infirmary, hired a part-time doctor for the plantation, and improved the housing. Etienne even went so far as to allow families to remain together, a rare practice on plantations where children were often sold far from their parents. These changes were not popular among other planters. They accused Etienne of weakness, of being manipulated by his black wife, of betraying his race and his class. But he no longer cared. He had discovered something more important than the approval of his peers, the peace of conscience. In February, Abeline discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Etienne with both immense joy and trembling fear. He would be a father. Their child would be born free, raised in love, never knowing the horrors of slavery. It was, he thought, a form of redemption. But cruel, pitiless fate had other plans. In May, as Abeline's pregnancy was progressing normally, she fell gravely ill. It was not cholera this time, but something more insidious, puerperal fever, complicated by an infection the doctors of that time could not treat. Dr. Renault was honest with Etienne. "I can do nothing," he said. "I'm sorry, it's now in the hands of God." Etienne refused to accept that verdict. He called for other doctors, tried every possible remedy, modern and traditional. Nothing worked. Abeline grew weaker day by day, her body consumed by illness and by the child she carried. One evening in mid-June, as the sun was setting over the Caribbean Sea, painting the sky with shades of crimson and gold, Abeline asked to be carried out to the veranda. She wanted to see the landscape one last time, to feel the warm breeze on her skin, to hear the song of the birds. And Etienne himself lifted her, with infinite gentleness, and placed her on a long chair surrounded by cushions. She was so frail now, so fragile as if she might vanish with the faintest breath of wind before her. "It's beautiful," she whispered, gazing at the burning sky. "I have never seen anything so beautiful." Etienne knelt beside her, holding her hand with desperate tenderness. "Don't leave," he pleaded, his voice broken. "Please don't leave me." Abeline turned her eyes toward him, and despite the pain, despite her weakness, she smiled. "You've changed, Etienne. You've become the man I always hoped you would be. I am proud of you." "That's not enough," he sobbed. "I need more time to show you how much I love you, to repair all the harm I've done to you." But she silenced him by softly placing a finger upon his lips. "There's nothing to repair. I forgave you, and I love you too." Those words, which Etienne had longed so desperately to hear, carried a taste both bitter and sweet. He heard them, but too late, far too late. That night, Abeline fell asleep in Etienne's arms, lulled by the murmur of the waves and the chirping of crickets. She never awoke. She died just before dawn on June 17th, 1838, at the age of 25, carrying within her the child she would never bring into the world. The funeral was simple but dignified. Etienne had Abeline buried in the Morel family cemetery beside his mother, a gesture that scandalized the high society of Martinique one final time. But he did not care. They could think what they wished. The only opinion that mattered to him was gone. After the burial, Etienne withdrew into the large house, now empty and silent. He no longer went out, saw no one, spending his days wandering like a ghost through rooms still echoing with Abeline's laughter, her voice, her presence. It was Madame Dubois who, a week after the funeral, came to find him in his office, where he sat motionless, staring into nothing. "Monsieur Morel," she said softly, "I must speak with you. It's about Madame Abeline." Etienne lifted toward her a dead, vacant gaze. "What do you mean?" The housekeeper hesitated, her face revealing an inner struggle. "While cleaning her room, I found this." She handed him a yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax. It was hidden in a secret compartment of her desk. Etienne took the envelope with a trembling hand. It was addressed to Abeline and dated 5 years before their marriage. With numb fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the document inside. It was an act of manumission. The words danced before his eyes, but their meaning was unmistakably clear, terrifyingly clear. When Abeline was only 19, the previous owner of the plantation, Etienne's father, had set her free. The reasons were not specified, but the document was legal, signed, and registered with the colonial authorities. Abeline had been free, legally free, for 5 years, but no one had ever told her. The paper had probably been stored away in the family archives and forgotten. Or perhaps, Etienne realized with horror, perhaps his father had deliberately hidden it, unwilling to lose a skilled servant. Maybe Abeline could have left, rebuilt her life, truly lived as a free woman. Instead, she had stayed, unaware of her rights, working as a slave though she no longer was one, until the day Etienne had married her in a supreme act of arrogance. The realization struck him like a hammer blow. He had not married his slave. He had married a free woman, one kept in ignorance of her own freedom. He had humiliated her, displayed her, turned her into a spectacle for Parisian gossip, when she had always had the right to refuse to leave to live her own life. And she had never known. Etienne felt his legs give way beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, the document pressed against his chest, and from his throat escaped a terrible cry, a howl of pure agony, unbearable guilt, absolute regret. Monsieur Morel, Madame Dubois approached, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I am so sorry. If only I had known earlier, but what could one say? What word could ease such torment? Abeline had spent the last years of her life in an invisible prison, believing she had no choice, when she had always been free to go. And when she had finally found happiness, when she had finally known true love, death had torn it from her. Etienne remained on the floor for hours, clutching that piece of paper, the symbol of everything he had stolen from Abeline. Not just her physical freedom, but her freedom of soul, her ability to choose. Truly her own life. When he finally rose to his feet, something inside him had broken irreparably. The weight of his guilt was crushing, unbearable. He had wanted to redeem himself, to become a better man, to atone for his mistakes. But how does one repair the irreparable? How does one ask forgiveness of the dead? In the days that followed, Etienne drifted in a state close to madness. He no longer ate, no longer slept, spending his nights rereading that cursed document, imagining what Abeline's life might have been if she had known. Would she have left the plantation? Would she have gone to France, where slavery was forbidden? Would she have met a man who loved her from the very first day, without cruelty, without humiliation? He went to her grave every day, kneeling in the damp earth, speaking to the cold stone as though it could hear him. I'm sorry, he repeated endlessly. I'm so sorry. You were free. You were always free, and I never told you. The silence was his only reply. In July, Etienne made a decision that shocked all of Martinique. He freed all the slaves on his plantation, 200 souls who, from one day to the next, became free. He also gave them small parcels of land to cultivate for themselves, and a wage if they chose to continue working for him. You are free, he told them during a gathering he organized before the great house. His voice was hoarse, broken. You may go or stay, it's your choice, but you will never again be my property. I have no right to own another human being. No one does. Some left immediately, running toward the freedom they had waited for all their lives. Others, with nowhere to go, chose to stay, working now for pay, meager though it was. Josephine, the old friend of Abeline's grandmother, approached Etienne and placed a trembling hand upon his arm. She would be proud of you, she said simply, in Creole. Abeline would be proud. Those words, far from comforting him, drove the knife of guilt even deeper. Proud. How could she ever be proud of him after what he had done to her, after stealing from her 5 years of freedom she could have known? The other planters were furious. Auguste Beaufort stormed onto the plantation a week after the emancipation, red with rage. Have you gone mad? He shouted. You've just freed a fortune, and you're setting a terrible example for all the other slaves on the island. They'll all want the same. You'll provoke a rebellion. Etienne looked at him with icy calm. Then let them rebel. Let them burn every plantation if that's what it takes for this monstrous system to end. I don't care. You're pathetic, spat Auguste with disgust. That black woman destroyed you completely. You're nothing but a shadow of what you once were. You're right, Etienne replied softly. I'm no longer the man I was, and I'm grateful for it. That man was a monster. Auguste left, slamming the door, vowing to ruin Etienne both socially and financially. He kept his word. In the months that followed, Etienne was ostracized by the entire high society of Martinique. His former friends refused to speak to him. The sugar merchants offered him miserable prices for his crops. His name became synonymous with betrayal and madness. But Etienne no longer cared. None of it mattered anymore. In September, he fell gravely ill. Grief, remorse, and guilt had eaten away at his body like a cancer of the soul. The doctors diagnosed consumption, tuberculosis, likely contracted during the long nights he had spent kneeling at Abeline's grave in the rain. He refused all treatment. He did not want to recover. What was the point of living when the only person who had given his life meaning was gone? What was the point of breathing when every breath was a torture of regret? Madame Dubois watched over him with devotion, bringing him broths he would not touch, changing the sheets soaked with sweat, praying for his tormented soul. "You must fight, Monsieur Morel," she pleaded. "You still have so much to do. You began something important by freeing your slaves. Other planters may follow your example. You could change things." But Etienne weakly shook his head. "It's too late. Everything came too late." Father Germain came to visit him several times, trying to offer spiritual comfort. "God is merciful," said the priest. "He forgives those who truly repent." "But Abeline," Etienne asked, his eyes burning with fever, "will she forgive me? How can I be forgiven by someone who is no longer here to grant it?" Father Germain had no answer. By late October, as the rainy season began again, Etienne felt his end approaching. He called for a notary and dictated his will. The plantation would be sold, and all profits divided equally among those he had freed. The great house would become a school for the black and mixed-race children of the region. And on his tomb, he wanted a single inscription: "Here lies a man who learned too." It was written, of a man who learned too late to be human. On November 3rd, as dawn barely broke, Madame Dubois entered Etienne's room to bring him his morning medicine. She found him motionless in his bed, eyes closed, holding against his chest Abeline's emancipation document and a miniature portrait of her that he had commissioned months earlier. He had died during the night, alone, haunted until his final breath by the terrible truth he had discovered too late. Etienne's funeral was as simple as Abeline's had been. Few people attended, only Madame Dubois, Father Germain, and a few of the freed slaves who, despite all he had put them through, acknowledged that he had tried to redeem himself in the end. He was buried beside Abeline, just as he had requested. On his tombstone, in accordance with his last wishes, the inscription he had chosen was engraved. And just beneath it, Father Germain, deeply moved by the tragedy, added a few words of his own. "And who paid the price for this lesson with everything he had." The plantation was sold, as planned. The money was distributed among the freedmen, giving them a chance to build new lives. The grand house truly became a school, the first in the region to accept black students. Josephine, the old friend of Abeline's family, lived long enough to see her grandchildren learn to read and write in that school. Before she died at the age of 78, she told their story, the story of Etienne and Abeline, to anyone who would listen. "It was a love story," she would say, "but also a story of everything that is wrong in our world. He married her out of cruelty and pride. He learned to love her for real. But the worst part is that she had been free from the beginning, and he never knew. He stole her freedom twice. Once by not telling her she was emancipated, and a second time by making her believe she had no choice but to marry him. She always paused there, letting her words sink in. "And you know what it teaches us," she would continue, "that the evil we do cannot always be repaired. Even if we change, even if we regret, even if we try to make amends, some things are broken forever." Years passed. Slavery was eventually abolished in Martinique, some 10 years after the deaths of Etienne and Abeline. The Morel plantation fell into ruin. The cane fields returned to wild nature, and the great house that had once sheltered so much pain, and briefly, so much love, was slowly swallowed by tropical vegetation. But their graves remained, side by side, beneath an old mango tree. Sometimes, people from the nearby village would come to pay their respects, bringing flowers and telling their story to younger generations. It was a warning, they would say, a warning against pride, against cruelty, against the monstrous system that once allowed human beings to own others. But it was also, in a way, a story of hope, because even the hardest man, even the coldest heart can learn to love, can change, can recognize his wrongs. The tragedy, of course, is that for Etienne and Abeline, that realization came too late, far, far too late. And that is where the true sorrow of this story lies, not in death, which comes for us all sooner or later, but in lost time, in the missed chances, in the hidden truths that could have changed everything, if only they had been revealed sooner. Abeline had been free for 5 years without knowing it, 5 years during which she could have left, lived, dreamed, chosen. Instead, she remained chained by ignorance, a prisoner of a lie by omission. And Etienne, who had discovered too late the humanity within himself, spent the rest of his short life consumed by a guilt no act of redemption could ever erase. Their story became a legend in Martinique, not the romantic kind with a happy ending, but the dark, unsettling kind that makes you think, that disturbs, that forces you to face the horrors of the past and the injustices of the present. For though their tale was unique in its details, the system that made it possible was not. Thousands of Abelines lived and died on the plantations of the Caribbean, their lives broken by an economy built upon dehumanization. And thousands of Etiennes took part in that system, some with deliberate cruelty, others with an indifference just as deadly. Today, the ruins of the Morel plantation have become a historical site. Informational plaques tell the story of Etienne and Abeline, and of the 200 people who once worked there as slaves before being freed in that desperate act of redemption. Tourists come, take pictures, nod gravely at the horrors of the past and leave. But a few stop before the 2 graves beneath the mango tree, read the words carved into the stone, eroded by more than a century of tropical rain, and truly understand. Understand that the story of Etienne and Abeline is not only a tragic love story. It is a story about power and its abuses, about pride and its consequences, about redemption that comes too late, about freedom stolen not once, but twice. It is a story about the fact that some wounds never heal, that some mistakes can never be corrected, that some truths, when discovered too late, do more harm than good. And above all, it is a brutal reminder that in a world built on injustice, even love stories end badly. For Abeline and Etienne could have had a life together, a true life, built on equality and mutual respect from the very beginning. If only she had been told that she was free, if only he had not been so arrogant, if only the system surrounding them had not been so deeply and irreparably corrupt. But if onlys do not change the past. They do not bring back the dead. They do not heal wounds. They merely remind us again and again that sometimes redemption comes too late, far, far too late. This story, though fictional in its specific characters, is inspired by real historical facts. Slavery in the French Caribbean colonies was a brutal system that destroyed millions of lives. The story of Etienne and Abeline reminds us that behind the statistics and historical dates, there were human beings, with their hopes, their dreams, their loves, and their tragedies. May their story, dark as it is, serve as a lesson never to forget the horrors of the past, and to build a future that is more just, more human, and more free.